Welcome to No Sleep, Historian, where the shadows of the past whisper louder than the present, and some truths are too foul to forget. Today's file: when the world stank. Moments in history when entire cities became unlivable, not from war or famine, but because the very air turned against them. This is not a story for the faint of stomach. Part 1. A noseful of history. Imagine stepping outside your home and immediately being assaulted by a wall of putrid air so thick you can taste it. Your eyes water, your throat closes, and your stomach lurches with each breath. This was not an apocalyptic nightmare. The human nose can detect over 1 trillion different scents, evolved as our first line of defense against danger. Our ancestors could smell death from miles away, detect spoiled food before it poisoned them, and sense when water had turned foul. But what happens when an entire city becomes a monument to decay? When the very air that sustains life becomes an enemy? For thousands of years, urban centers were cauldrons of human waste, rotting food, decomposing animals, and industrial byproducts. Without modern sewage systems, garbage collection, or even basic understanding of hygiene, cities became toxic landscapes where survival meant adapting to constant assault on the senses. Ancient Rome, despite its engineering marvels, reeked of human excrement and industrial waste. Citizens would empty chamber pots directly into the streets from upper-story windows, often without warning those below. The famous Cloaca Maxima sewer system handled only a fraction of the city's waste. Most Romans lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings where sanitation was non-existent and waste accumulated in courtyards and basements. The poet Martial wrote scathingly about Rome's stench, describing neighborhoods where the air itself seems thick with filth and where no perfume can mask the underlying rot. Archaeological evidence supports these literary accounts. Medieval cities were even worse. London in the 13th century had official rakers whose job was to remove waste from streets. But their efforts were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of refuse. Citizens threw everything into the streets, including butcher scraps, human waste, dead animals, and industrial byproducts from tanning, brewing, and metalworking. The waste would pile up until rain washed it into rivers and streams, creating toxic runoff that poisoned water supplies downstream. Paris developed its own unique aromatic character thanks to its concentration of trades. The Isle de la housed tanners who used urine and feces to treat leather. Fish merchants along the Seine left scales and entrails to rot in the sun. The stench was so pervasive that wealthy Parisians carried nosegays and pomanders filled with aromatic herbs to mask the smell. But these were not merely matters of comfort. Before germ theory, people believed in miasma, the idea that disease spread through bad air. This wasn't entirely wrong. Many diseases do correlate with poor sanitation, though the mechanism wasn't understood. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was attributed to poisonous air rising from rotting matter. Citizens burned herbs and spices in their homes, carried aromatic sachets, and avoided areas known for particularly foul odors. The connection between smell and disease created a feedback loop of fear. When epidemics struck, the first response was often to identify and eliminate sources of bad smells. This led to the burning of corrupted goods. Wealthy citizens developed elaborate strategies for managing urban stench. They built homes with thick walls, small windows, and interior courtyards designed to minimize exposure to street-level air. They employed servants whose sole job was maintaining aromatic gardens and burning incense. Some wealthy Romans even had slaves whose job was to carry braziers of burning aromatic woods ahead of them when they ventured into the city. The poor had no such luxuries. They lived in the worst-smelling neighborhoods, often directly above or adjacent to industries that produced the most noxious odors. Tanners, dyers, and metal workers were typically relegated to specific districts downwind from wealthy areas. These neighborhoods developed their own cultures of survival, where residents learned to breathe through their mouths, work in short shifts to minimize exposure, and seek relief in public baths when available. Archaeological evidence reveals the ingenuity people developed to cope with urban stench. Roman homes often featured elaborate ventilation systems designed to create airflow that would carry odors away from living spaces. The psychological impact of chronic exposure to foul odors shaped entire civilizations. Medieval literature is filled with references to the corruption of cities versus the purity of rural air. This wasn't just poetic metaphor, but reflected genuine trauma from living in environments where every breath was an assault. Religious movements often incorporated purification rituals that included cleansing of both body and environment, recognizing the connection between physical and spiritual corruption. Trade routes developed partly to avoid the worst-smelling cities. Merchants would plan journeys to minimize time spent in particularly noxious urban centers. Some cities gained reputations that affected their economic development. Bradford in England became known for its wool processing stench that could be detected from miles away. Naples developed a reputation for the smell of sulfur from nearby volcanic activity mixed with urban waste. The seasonal cycle of stench shaped urban life in ways we can barely imagine. Spring brought the thaw of winter's accumulated waste, creating a toxic soup as frozen refuse decomposed rapidly. Summer heat would bake organic matter into concentrated essences of rot that hung in the air like visible clouds. Fall harvests would bring new sources of organic waste as food processing created additional layers of decay. Winter offered the only respite, as freezing temperatures would trap most odors until the cycle began again. Certain trades attracted workers who had either lost their sense of smell or developed remarkable tolerance for noxious odors. These individuals became essential workers in the worst industries, often developing their own guild systems and commanding premium wages for their ability to work in environments that would incapacitate others. The architecture of historical cities reveals how profoundly stench shaped human settlement patterns. Churches were built on hills whenever possible, not just for defensive purposes, but to catch cleaner air. Wealthy districts clustered around high points and prevailing wind patterns. Markets and industrial areas were carefully positioned downwind from residential areas when geography allowed. Understanding this olfactory history helps explain why the development of modern sanitation was such a revolutionary achievement. The conquest of urban stench wasn't just about comfort or health, but about fundamentally changing what it meant to live in a city. For the first time in human history, urban centers could become places of refuge rather than assault on the senses. Part 2. The Great Stink of London, 1858. The summer of 1858 nearly brought the British Empire to its knees. Not through military defeat or economic collapse, but through the overwhelming power of smell. What became known as the Great Stink transformed London into an almost uninhabitable city and forced one of the most dramatic public health reforms in human history. By 1858, London had become the largest city in the world, with over 2.5 million residents crammed into an area never designed for such density. The medieval infrastructure groaned under the pressure of modern urban life. Most critically, London's sewage system was a patchwork of ancient tunnels, open ditches, and improvised solutions that had evolved haphazardly over centuries. The River Thames, once the lifeblood of commerce and transportation, had become London's toilet. Over 200,000 cesspits throughout the city were supposed to contain human waste, but most were poorly built and regularly overflowed. Professional night soil men were supposed to empty these pits and cart the waste away, but the system was completely overwhelmed. The introduction of flush toilets in the 1840s, ironically intended as a sanitary improvement, made the crisis exponentially worse. Instead of waste sitting in local cesspits, where it would eventually be carted away, flush toilets sent torrents of sewage directly into storm drains that led straight to the river. What had been a manageable trickle of waste became a flood of liquid sewage. The Thames had become an open sewer stretching through the heart of the empire's capital. Industrial waste from factories, slaughterhouses, and chemical works mixed with human excrement, dead animals, and organic refuse from London's markets. Gasworks along the river contributed coal, tar, and sulfur compounds. Tanneries added the stench of rotting hides treated with urine and excrement. Contemporary accounts struggle to convey the intensity of the stench. Charles Dickens wrote of walking along the Thames and being overcome by waves of hot, sick sewer gas smell that made him physically ill. The medical officer of health described the river as one vast drain, producing pestilential vapors that could be smelled from miles away. The summer of 1858 brought perfect conditions for olfactory disaster. A prolonged drought reduced the Thames to its lowest level in memory, concentrating the sewage and exposing vast mudflats coated with decades of accumulated waste. The heat created anaerobic fermentation on a massive scale. Hydrogen sulfide produced the characteristic rotten egg smell. Methane bubbles rose to the surface and popped, releasing concentrated bursts of putrescence. Ammonia from decomposing organic matter burned the eyes and throat of anyone who came near the river. The biochemical processes in the Thames were producing a toxic cocktail of gases that made normal breathing difficult and sometimes impossible. Parliament, located directly on the Thames, became ground zero for the crisis. Members of the House of Commons and House of Lords found it impossible to conduct business with the windows open. They soaked curtains in chloride of lime, a primitive disinfectant, but the chemical smell only added another layer to the assault on their senses. The crisis reached its peak in June and July, when several members of Parliament collapsed during sessions. The Speaker of the House was forced to adjourn multiple times when the stench made coherent speech impossible. Committees investigating the sewage crisis had to meet in rooms on the opposite side of their buildings, as far from the Thames as possible. Benjamin Disraeli, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, famously described the Thames as a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. London's working classes bore the worst of the crisis. Those living in riverside neighborhoods like Bermondsey, Rotherhithe, and Wapping faced concentrated exposure to the toxic air. Factory workers along the Thames frequently collapsed from exposure to the fumes. Watermen and dock workers, whose livelihoods depended on river access, developed chronic respiratory problems and digestive issues from prolonged exposure. The medical community initially focused on miasma theory, believing the bad air itself caused disease. Dr. John Snow had already identified contaminated water as the source of cholera outbreaks, but his findings hadn't yet gained widespread acceptance. Most doctors attributed the wave of illnesses to the poisonous vapors rising from the Thames, not understanding that the same sewage contaminating the air was also poisoning the water supply. Hospitals near the river were overwhelmed with patients suffering from what doctors called Thames fever. Tourism plummeted as visitors fled London's unbearable atmosphere. River traffic, essential to London's commerce, was disrupted as workers refused to operate boats on the Thames. Property values in riverside areas collapsed as residents abandoned their homes. Several businesses relocated operations outside London rather than subject employees to the toxic conditions. The crisis forced dramatic political action, received emergency funding to begin immediate remediation efforts. They spread lime along the riverbank to neutralize some of the acid produced by decomposing waste. They installed temporary screens to trap the worst floating debris. But these were mere stopgap measures against a crisis that demanded fundamental infrastructure change. The legislation authorized the most ambitious public works project in London's history, a comprehensive sewage system that would intercept waste before it reached the Thames and transport it far downstream from the city. The project would cost more than the entire annual budget of many European nations. Bazalgette's solution was revolutionary in its scope. He designed a network of interceptor sewers running parallel to the Thames that would collect waste from the existing system and channel it to treatment works far east of London. The engineering challenges were immense, requiring the construction of over 1,000 miles of new sewers, massive pumping stations, and treatment facilities capable of handling the waste of millions of people. The immediate response to the crisis also revealed class divisions in Victorian London. Wealthy residents could afford to leave the city during the worst periods, retreating to country estates or seaside resorts. They could install primitive air filtration systems in their homes and purchase aromatic substances to mask the smell. The poor had no such options and suffered disproportionately from both the immediate effects of the stench and the diseases it helped spread. The Great Stink marked a turning point in urban planning and public health policy. It demonstrated that environmental problems could threaten the stability of even the most powerful nations. The crisis forced acknowledgement that public health was a government responsibility, not a private matter. It showed that infrastructure investment was essential for urban civilization to function. The comprehensive approach, combining immediate emergency measures with long-term infrastructure development, became the template for addressing urban environmental disasters. The success of Bazalgette's system proved that engineering solutions could solve problems that had seemed insurmountable. Part 3: Paris, the City of Smells. Medieval Paris earned its reputation as one of the most malodorous cities in Europe through a perfect storm of geography, industry, and population density. Built on an island in the Seine and spreading onto both banks, Paris became a concentrated cauldron of human and industrial waste that created a unique olfactory signature recognizable from miles away. The Aile de la, the original heart of Paris, housed the city's most noxious industries in a space roughly half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide. Tanners who processed animal hides into leather, dominated the island's economy and its atmosphere. The tanning process required soaking raw hides in vats of urine, excrement, and rotting organic matter for weeks at a time. The chemical breakdown of proteins and fats created hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and other sulfur compounds that produced an eye-watering stench. Master tanners in medieval Paris developed elaborate systems for collecting and aging urine. They maintained contracts with public houses and monasteries for regular supplies of human waste. Some tanners employed children to collect dog and pigeon excrement from the streets, paying by the bucket for the freshest specimens. The aged urine and feces were mixed with tree bark, containing tannins, to create a fermented soup that transformed raw hides into usable leather. The tanning district alone employed over 3,000 workers who spent their days immersed in this toxic environment. Contemporary accounts describe tanners whose clothes were permanently stained and whose skin had taken on a yellowish tinge from constant exposure to the chemicals. Many suffered from chronic respiratory problems and skin conditions. Adjacent to the tanning quarter, the butchers of Les Halles created their own aromatic contribution to Parisian air. The central market processed thousands of animals daily, creating mountains of awful blood and organic waste. Butchers would slaughter animals in courtyards and streets, allowing blood to flow freely into gutters. Entrails and unusable parts were supposed to be carted away, but the removal system was inadequate for the volume of waste produced. The butcher's quarter developed its own ecosystem of scavengers. Packs of semi-wild dogs roamed the area, feeding on scraps and adding their own waste to the mix. Rats multiplied in the organic matter, creating additional layers of decay as their carcasses joined the refuse. Clouds of flies bred in the rotting matter, creating visible swarms that added to the horror of the district's appearance and smell. Fish merchants along the Seine added another dimension to Paris's olfactory palette. River fish, ocean fish, transported in carts from coastal ports, and shellfish were sold from stalls directly on the riverbank. In summer heat, unsold fish would rapidly decompose, creating the distinctive ammonia smell of rotting seafood. Fish scales, heads, and entrails were dumped directly into the Seine, where they would wash up on downstream shores in various states of decay. The city's waste management system was primitive, even by medieval standards. Human waste from the growing population was collected in public. Latrines built over streams that fed into the Seine. Private homes used chamber pots that were emptied into gutters or dumped from windows onto the streets below. The famous Cry Gardes, low, warned pedestrians of impending waste showers from upper-story windows, but the warning was often ignored or ineffective. Paris's unique geography made the smell problem worse than in other medieval cities. Built in a river valley with limited air circulation, the city trapped odors like a bowl. Prevailing winds were often insufficient to carry away the concentrated fumes from thousands of sources of decay and fermentation. During periods of high atmospheric pressure, a visible haze of organic vapors would settle over the city like a malodorous fog. The concentration of industries created synergistic effects that amplified individual smells. The ammonia from tanneries would combine with hydrogen sulfide from butchers and organic acids from fish markets to create new compounds that were more offensive than any single source. Visitors to Paris often commented that the city's smell was unlike anything they had experienced elsewhere, a unique blend that couldn't be replicated. Religious authorities recognized the connection between the city's stench and spiritual corruption. Cathedral records from the 13th century describe special prayers for purification of the air and blessings for workers in the most noxious trades. Some monasteries developed specialized roles as refuges from urban stench, offering aromatic gardens and incense-filled chapels as respite from the toxic streets. The wealthy developed elaborate strategies for managing their exposure to Parisian smells. Noble families built their residences on hills outside the city center when possible, traveling into the commercial districts only when necessary. They employed servants whose primary job was maintaining aromatic environments, burning expensive imported spices and herbs to mask urban odors. Wealthy Parisians pioneered the use of architectural features designed to minimize smell exposure. They built homes with small windows facing the street and large windows opening onto interior courtyards. They created rooms specifically for changing clothes after exposure to city air, recognizing that fabrics absorbed and held odors for extended periods. Some wealthy homes featured primitive air filtration systems using cloth screens soaked in aromatic oils. The perfume industry in Paris developed partly as a response to the city's overwhelming natural stench. Perfumers became valued artisans who could create scents strong enough to mask even the most offensive urban odors. The famous parfumers of medieval Paris developed techniques for concentrating aromatic oils and creating long-lasting scents that could provide hours of relief from city air. Professional categories emerged based on tolerance for different types of smells. Street sweepers, waste collectors, and sewer workers commanded premium wages for their willingness to work in the most offensive environments. These workers often developed their own guild systems and cultural practices, including special diets believed to reduce sensitivity to bad odors and remedies for the health effects of chronic exposure. The city's smell became part of its identity and economy in unexpected ways. Paris-trained tanners and butchers were considered superior craftsmen, partly because they had learned to work effectively in the most challenging olfactory conditions. Visitors came to Paris partly to experience its infamous atmosphere, viewing exposure to the city's stench as a rite of passage or proof of urban sophistication. Seasonal variations in Paris's smell created annual cycles that shaped urban life. Spring brought the thaw of winter's accumulated waste, creating a concentrated release of months of frozen decay. Summer heat would intensify all smells and add new sources as food spoiled more rapidly. Autumn would bring new organic waste from harvest activities and food preservation. Winter provided the only relief, as freezing temperatures would suppress most sources of odor. The psychological impact of chronic exposure to extreme, urban stench-shaped Parisian culture in profound ways. Literature from medieval Paris is filled with references to the corruption of city air and the purification of rural environments. Religious movements emphasized cleansing rituals that included both spiritual and physical purification. The contrast between urban corruption and natural purity became a central theme in French cultural development. Paris's reputation for smell created economic challenges and opportunities. Trade relationships sometimes suffered as foreign merchants complained about conditions in the city. However, Paris's concentration of skilled craftsmen in the most challenging industries also created economic advantages, as Parisian artisans could work effectively in conditions that would incapacitate competitors from other cities. The eventual transformation of Paris's smell landscape required centuries of gradual reform. Unlike London's sudden crisis and dramatic response, Paris evolved more slowly, with individual reforms addressing specific sources of stench over time. The process revealed how deeply embedded urban smells had become in the city's economic and social structures, requiring fundamental changes to industries and lifestyles that had defined Parisian identity for generations. Part 4. The Black Death's Aroma. The bubonic plague that swept across Europe in the 14th century brought with it an olfactory nightmare that traumatized entire civilizations and fundamentally changed how humans understood the relationship between smell, disease, and death. The Black Death didn't just kill between 75 and 200 million people. It filled the air with the concentrated essence of human mortality on a scale never before experienced. The plague's smell began with the victims themselves. Bubonic plague caused characteristic swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, armpits, and neck. These swellings would grow to the size of apples or eggs and often rupture, leaking pus and blood that carried a distinctive sweet, sickly odor. Contemporary accounts describe the smell as unlike normal wound infection, with a cloying quality that seemed to stick in the throat and linger in enclosed spaces. Pneumonic plague, the lung-based form that developed in some victims, produced its own horrific aromatic signature. Victims would cough up blood mixed with infected lung tissue, creating a metallic smell combined with the putrid odor of decomposing organic matter. Chronicles from the period describe entire households where this bloody expectoration would coat walls and floors, creating concentrated sources of stench that made homes uninhabitable even after the occupants died. The speed of death during plague outbreaks meant that bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio described how the consecrated ground in every churchyard was insufficient for the great number of bodies, which were brought thither every day. Bodies were stacked in plague pits, massive excavations that could hold hundreds of corpses. These pits became fermentation chambers, where human remains decomposed in anaerobic conditions, producing hydrogen sulfide, methane, and other gases that created visible vapor clouds. The chemistry of mass death created smells that defied normal human experience. When hundreds of bodies decompose together, the process generates heat through bacterial action, accelerating decay and concentrating odors. The interaction between different stages of decomposition creates complex chemical reactions that produce new compounds not found in individual deaths. Medieval chroniclers struggled to describe these smells, often resorting to religious imagery about the opening of hell or divine punishment. Plague pits were typically excavated on the outskirts of towns and cities, but the stench they produced could carry for miles, depending on wind conditions. The town of Tournai in Belgium developed a reputation throughout northern Europe for its plague pit odors, which travelers reported detecting from several miles away. The psychological association between these smells and mass death. The overwhelming number of dead animals added another layer to the plague's olfactory impact. Rats, the primary carriers of plague fleas, died in enormous numbers before human outbreaks began. Streets would be littered with rat carcasses that no one dared touch for fear of contagion. Domestic animals also succumbed to plague or died from neglect as their human caretakers fell ill. Horses, cattle, pigs, and chickens would rot where they died, creating a landscape of decay that extended the plague's smell throughout urban and rural areas. Medieval medicine's understanding of miasma, or bad air, made smell central to both the perceived cause and potential cure of plague. Physicians believed that poisonous vapors rising from corrupted matter caused disease, so they focused intensely on identifying and counteracting sources of bad smells. This led to elaborate theories about which odors were dangerous and which were protective, creating a complex mythology around the plague's aromatic dimensions. The famous plague doctor costume, with its bird-like beak, was designed primarily to combat smell-based transmission. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and other substances believed to purify the air before it reached the physician's lungs. Common filling materials included rosemary, thyme, dried roses, carnations, and sometimes more exotic substances like unicorn horn or powdered viper. The costume's leather construction was intended to prevent plague vapors from penetrating to the physician's skin. Entire cities developed elaborate systems for combating the plague's smell with counteromas. Venice burned massive quantities of aromatic woods in public squares. Florence mandated that all citizens carry sachets of protective herbs. Paris implemented requirements that all buildings burn specific incense blends during daylight hours. These efforts created new aromatic landscapes where the natural smells of plague mixed with intensive human attempts at olfactory defense. The economic disruption caused by plague fear created additional sources of stench. As normal waste removal systems broke down due to worker deaths and social collapse, garbage and human waste accumulated in streets and squares. Markets closed, leaving perishable goods to rot in place. Abandoned workshops contained materials that decomposed without proper maintenance. The normal aromatic cycle of urban life was replaced by layers of neglect and decay that compounded the plague's direct olfactory impact. Religious responses to the plague created their own smells that became permanently associated with the pandemic. Mass funeral pyres, often the only way to dispose of bodies quickly enough to prevent complete social breakdown, produced the distinctive smell of burning human flesh mixed with wood smoke. This odor, described by survivors as unlike anything in normal experience, traumatized entire populations and appeared in nightmares and religious visions for generations. Churches and monasteries became centers of intensive aromatic activity as religious communities tried to protect themselves through prayer and purification rituals. The burning of enormous quantities of frankincense, myrrh, and other sacred aromatics created clouds of religious incense that mixed with the underlying smells of death and decay. Some chronicles describe churches where the aromatic intensity was so overwhelming that worshippers would faint during services. The plague's smell created lasting changes in architecture and urban planning. Churches began incorporating better ventilation systems and larger windows to prevent the accumulation of corrupted air. Cemeteries were relocated further from city centers, and new burial practices developed to minimize odor production. Some cities implemented the first systematic approaches to waste management, specifically to prevent the accumulation of materials that might generate plague-associated smells. The psychological impact of the plague's aroma created cultural associations that persisted for centuries. The smell of certain herbs and spices used in plague protection became permanently linked with death and disease in popular consciousness. Certain types of incense fell out of favor because of their association with plague-era funeral practices. Even the smell of certain flowers became ominous because they had been used in plague protection rituals that ultimately failed. Professional plague management created new occupational categories defined by their relationship to the pandemic's smells. Body collectors developed techniques for working in the most overwhelming olfactory conditions, often using alcohol and aromatic substances to dull their senses. Plague pit diggers created their own guild systems and specialized tools for managing decomposing remains. These workers commanded high wages but suffered high mortality rates and social stigma that lasted long after the pandemic ended. The geographical spread of plague can be partially tracked through contemporary descriptions of its characteristic smells. Chronicles from different regions describe the arrival of plague through accounts of strange odors that preceded human cases. The smell of plague became an early warning system that sometimes allowed communities to implement protective measures before the disease actually arrived in their area. The Black Death's olfactory legacy influenced European culture's relationship with smell for centuries afterward. The intense association between bad odors and deadly disease reinforced beliefs about miasma that would persist until the development of germ theory. The trauma of experiencing death smell on such a massive scale created cultural taboos around certain odors and established patterns of aromatic avoidance that became embedded in social customs and architectural practices. Part 5. The Siege, Stenches. Throughout military history, the siege has been humanity's most patient and inexorable form of warfare, designed to slowly strangle a city or fortress into submission through starvation and desperation. But sieges created another weapon, more immediate and overwhelming than hunger. They transformed enclosed urban spaces into concentrated chambers of decay, where the very air became toxic, and surrender often came not from empty stomachs, but from the impossibility of breathing. The fundamental dynamic of siege warfare created perfect conditions for olfactory catastrophe. When an enemy army surrounded a city and cut off all supply lines, normal waste disposal systems immediately broke down. Garbage that would normally be carted outside the walls accumulated in streets and squares. Human waste that would be deposited in fields beyond the city limits instead filled every available pit and ditch within the fortifications. Dead animals that would normally be butchered and consumed outside urban areas were processed inside the walls, creating piles of bones, hides, and offal that had nowhere to go. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 provided a horrific example of how enclosed urban spaces could become uninhabitable through concentrated decay. The Byzantine capital, home to perhaps 100,000 people, found itself surrounded by Ottoman forces for 54 days. With all gates sealed and sea access blocked, the city's waste management systems immediately collapsed. Streets began filling with refuse that would normally have been carried outside the walls for disposal in countryside areas. Contemporary accounts from inside Constantinople describe how the smell began gradually, but built to overwhelming intensity. During the first week, residents noticed the accumulation of garbage in market areas. By the second week, human waste from private homes was being dumped into streets because the city's public latrines were overflowing. After a month, chronicler George Francis wrote that the air inside the city had become thick with the vapors of corruption. and that many defenders were falling ill, not from wounds or hunger, but from breathing the poisoned atmosphere. The siege of Paris during the Franco-Prussian War of 1872-71 demonstrated how even modern cities could be reduced to toxic environments through blockade. Paris, with over 1 million residents, was completely surrounded by Prussian forces for over 4 months. The city's sophisticated waste management systems, designed for normal conditions, were overwhelmed by the inability to transport refuse outside the siege lines. Sewage systems backed up, creating underground reservoirs of waste that produced methane and hydrogen sulfide gases that seeped into basements and ground floor rooms throughout the city. Parisians during the siege developed elaborate personal strategies for managing exposure to the increasingly toxic air. Wealthy residents burned expensive aromatic substances continuously in their homes, creating aromatic barriers against the surrounding stench. The middle classes organized neighborhood committees to manage local waste disposal, creating concentrated dumping areas that they hoped would contain the worst smells to specific districts. The poor, crowded into the most affected neighborhoods, suffered disproportionately from respiratory problems and digestive ailments caused by constant exposure to toxic vapors. The death of animals during sieges created particularly intense sources of stench that often proved decisive in forcing surrender. When food supplies dwindled, cities would slaughter their horses, cattle, pigs, and other large animals for meat. But the complete utilization of animal carcasses requires extensive processing infrastructure that rarely existed within siege walls. Bones, hides, entrails, and other inedible portions would accumulate faster than they could be disposed of, creating massive organic waste piles that fermented in the heat and produced concentrated clouds of putrid vapor. During the siege of Leningrad in World War II, the city's 2.5 million residents endured 872 days of complete encirclement by German forces. The waste disposal crisis began within weeks of the siege's start and continued throughout the ordeal. With no way to transport garbage outside the city and insufficient fuel to burn organic waste, Leningrad's streets filled with refuse that included human waste, food scraps, dead animals, and eventually human corpses. The smell became so overwhelming that survivors described being able to navigate the city by scent alone, identifying different neighborhoods by their characteristic odors. The psychological warfare aspect of siege stench was often more effective than direct military assault. Defenders who could withstand hunger, cold, and even direct attack would often break when faced with air that had become impossible to breathe. The siege of Sarajevo during the Bosnian War lasted from 1992 to 1996, making it the longest siege in modern warfare. Survivors described how the accumulation of waste and the breakdown of sanitation systems created atmospheric conditions that were as demoralizing as sniper fire or artillery bombardment. Siege defenders developed innovative but often desperate solutions to manage waste accumulation. During the siege of Vienna in 1529, defenders began throwing waste over the city walls toward Ottoman positions, hoping to create sanitary problems in the enemy camp while reducing accumulation inside the city. This practice often backfired when prevailing winds carried the odors back into the city, or when enemy forces used catapults to return the waste with added materials like diseased animal carcasses. The siege of Vicksburg during the American Civil War in 1863 illustrated how southern cities could be rendered uninhabitable through concentrated decay. Vicksburg's 4,500 residents and defending Confederate troops found themselves trapped for 47 days in Mississippi summer heat. The city's normal waste disposal relied on the Mississippi River, but Union control of the waterway prevented normal sanitation practices. Waste accumulated in ravines and caves where residents sheltered from artillery bombardment, creating concentrated sources of stench in the very spaces people needed for survival. Military engineers on both sides of sieges recognized smell as a tactical weapon. Attacking forces would sometimes position dead animals, human waste, or other rotting materials upwind from besieged cities to compound the olfactory pressure on defenders. Defenders would respond by trying to create aromatic barriers, using smoke from burning aromatic woods, or by constructing wind barriers designed to redirect toxic vapors away from critical defensive positions. The Siege of Orleans in 1428–29 during the 100 Years' War demonstrated how winter conditions could actually intensify siege stenches rather than providing relief. Frozen waste would accumulate throughout cold months, then rapidly thaw and ferment when temperatures rose, creating concentrated releases of toxic vapors that overwhelmed defenders who had survived months of gradual deterioration. Joan of Arc's successful relief of Orleans came partly because the English siege camp had itself become uninhabitable due to waste accumulation and poor sanitation. Medical understanding of siege-related illness focused heavily on corrupted air and bad vapors. Siege physicians developed theories about which smells were merely offensive versus actually dangerous, creating elaborate classification systems for different types of toxic air. These medical practitioners often became casualties themselves, as their close examination of patients and waste-related diseases required prolonged exposure to the most dangerous atmospheric conditions. The social dynamics within besieged cities were profoundly shaped by differential exposure to toxic smells. Wealthy residents could afford aromatic substances and often controlled the cleanest areas within city walls. Military commanders typically requisitioned the best ventilated buildings for their headquarters, leaving common soldiers and civilians to endure the worst atmospheric conditions. These disparities often created internal conflicts that weakened defense efforts more effectively than external military pressure. Siege warfare evolved to exploit the olfactory vulnerability of enclosed populations. Military manuals from the medieval period describe techniques for maximizing the aromatic pressure on besieged cities, including the strategic placement of latrines and waste dumps to ensure that prevailing winds would carry offensive odors into enemy territory. Some siege forces would deliberately contaminate water sources with rotting materials, creating additional sources of toxic vapor within the besieged city. The end of sieges often came suddenly when atmospheric conditions became completely unbearable. Historical records show numerous cases where cities surrendered not when food supplies were exhausted, but when the air quality deteriorated beyond human tolerance. The Siege of Rochelle in 1628 ended when defenders could no longer man the walls due to toxic vapors rising from accumulated waste and decomposing bodies in the city's lower elevations. Post-siege recovery required extensive environmental remediation that often took longer than rebuilding physical infrastructure. Cities that had endured long sieges needed months or even years to eliminate the sources of stench that had accumulated during the blockade. Some neighborhoods were completely abandoned because the smell had become so embedded in building materials and soil that normal cleaning was ineffective. Archaeological evidence shows that some siege-affected areas remained sparsely populated for generations after the military conflict ended. The trauma of siege stench influenced military architecture and urban planning for centuries. City planners began incorporating better ventilation systems and waste management infrastructure specifically designed to function during siege conditions. Fortress designs included features intended to maintain air quality during prolonged blockades, including specialized waste disposal systems and ventilation shafts that could operate even when gates were sealed. Part 6. The Industrial Stink Age. The year was 1854, and Manchester, England, had earned a new title. Not the Cottonopolis that civic leaders preferred, but something far more accurate. Visitors called it the chimney of the world, though that was generous. Chimneys, at least, carried smoke away. What Manchester had become was something else entirely. A cauldron of human suffering, seasoned with the most vile odors ever concentrated in one place. Welcome to the Industrial Stink Age, when humanity's greatest leap forward came wrapped in a cloud of toxic fumes that could knock a grown man unconscious at 50 yards. The transformation began innocently enough. Small workshops gave way to massive factories. Water wheels surrendered to steam engines. And with each belching smokestack, each new tannery, each slaughterhouse built to feed the growing masses of workers, the very air itself became an enemy. In Manchester's textile district, the morning shift began at 5:04. Workers stumbled through streets where the fog wasn't weather. It was a cocktail of sulfur dioxide, ammonia, and particles of cotton fiber mixed with human waste. The river Irwell, once clear enough to see the bottom, now ran colors that had no names. On Tuesdays, it flowed deep purple from the dye works. By Thursday, it had shifted to a sickly yellow-green that made children retch just from looking at it. But Manchester was just the beginning. Across the industrializing world, cities were transforming into open-air laboratories of human endurance. How much poison could people breathe and still work 14-hour shifts? How toxic could water become before it finally killed you? These weren't scientific questions. They were economic ones. And the answers came written in the ledgers of undertakers. Chicago's Union Stockyards opened in 1865 and immediately began rewriting the rules of urban stench. Picture this. On a good day, the yards processed 21,000 cattle, 75,000 hogs, and 22,000 sheep. On a bad day, when the wind was wrong and the temperature just right, the smell traveled 15 miles. Families in affluent neighborhoods would pack up and leave town for weeks during the summer months, when the combination of rotting, awful, industrial chemicals and raw sewage created an atmospheric poison that defied description. The workers who couldn't leave developed what doctors called stockyard lung, a condition that made breathing feel like drowning in thick, putrid air. Children born in the neighborhoods surrounding the yards often died before their second birthdays, though official causes of death rarely mentioned the daily assault of toxic fumes that turned their lungs into diseased sponges. In Pittsburgh, the steel mills created their own hellscape. The Bessemer process, revolutionary for making steel, produced clouds of iron oxide that settled on everything like rust-colored snow. But the real horror was the coke ovens. These massive furnaces converted coal into the fuel needed for steel production, and in doing so, they released a cocktail of chemicals that would make a modern environmental scientist weep. Benzene, toluene, hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide. These weren't just industrial byproducts. They were weapons deployed against an unsuspecting population. The smell was so overwhelming that newcomers to the city would vomit uncontrollably for their first week. Locals called it getting your Pittsburgh stomach, as if poisoning yourself was some kind of civic initiation. The Monongahela River, which supplied drinking water to hundreds of thousands, became a flowing cesspit of industrial waste. Steel mills dumped their slag directly into the water, creating artificial reefs of toxic sludge. Oil refineries added their own special contribution, a rainbow sheen that covered the surface and released fumes so potent they could ignite from a careless cigarette. But perhaps nowhere was the industrial assault on human senses more concentrated than in London's East End. The gasworks at Beckton processed coal into illuminating gas for the entire city, and in doing so, they created byproducts that seemed designed by some malevolent chemist specifically to torture the human nose. Coal tar, ammonia, liquor, and sulfur compounds flowed freely into the surrounding neighborhoods. The Beckton Works employed over 3,000 men, and every one of them went home each night reeking of chemicals that no amount of washing could remove. Their wives learned to sleep with windows open, even in winter, because the alternative was to spend the night breathing air thick with industrial poisons. The River Lee, which bordered the gasworks, became what local newspapers politely called discolored. In reality, it had become a flowing experiment in industrial toxicology. Fish died in massive numbers, floating belly up in pools of oily waste that reflected the gas flames like some hellish mirror. Workers at these sites developed survival strategies that seem almost medieval in their desperation. Some stuffed rags soaked in cheap gin up their noses, believing alcohol would neutralize the worst chemicals. Others chewed tobacco constantly, thinking the strong taste would somehow protect their lungs. Most simply prayed they would die quickly when their time came, rather than slowly suffocating on their own poisoned breath. The social geography of these industrial cities revealed a brutal truth about who suffered most from the stench. The wealthy retreated to suburbs upwind of the factories. The middle class found homes near parks or rivers, where breezes might offer some relief. The poor, the people who actually worked in these hellholes, were trapped in neighborhoods that had become uninhabitable by any reasonable standard. In Birmingham, England, the brass foundries created a particularly insidious form of atmospheric torture. The process of making brass required heating zinc and copper to extreme temperatures, releasing zinc oxide clouds that turned the air a ghostly white. Workers called it brass founder's ague, a condition that caused violent shaking, vomiting, and fever that could last for days. But the real horror was the lead works. Lead smelting produced fumes so toxic that workers rarely lasted more than a few years before developing what doctors carefully termed painter's colic, actually lead poisoning that caused excruciating abdominal pain, paralysis, and eventually death. The neighborhoods around these smelters became graveyards for the living, places where children played in yards contaminated with lead dust, while their parents slowly went insane from chronic poisoning. The tanners created their own special brand of olfactory hell. The process of turning animal hides into leather required soaking them in solutions of urine, feces, and lime for weeks. The smell was so overpowering that tanning districts were always built downwind of the main city. creating sacrifice zones where human habitation became an act of desperate poverty. In New York's Lower East Side, the Gowanus Canal became the city's unofficial sewer for everything too toxic to dump directly into the harbor. Tanneries, chemical plants, and gasworks all contributed to what locals called Lavender Lake, though the purple color had nothing to do with flowers and everything to do with industrial dyes that could burn exposed skin on contact. The workers who built the industrial age paid a price that no economic theory could justify. They breathed air that modern safety standards would classify as immediately dangerous to life and health. They drank water that contained levels of heavy metals that would trigger emergency evacuations today. And they did it all while being told they were participating in humanity's greatest achievement. The children suffered most. Industrial cities had infant mortality rates that approached medieval levels, though the causes were distinctly modern. Instead of plague or famine, babies died from respiratory failure caused by breathing air thick with coal, smoke, and chemical fumes. Those who survived often grew up stunted, their lungs scarred by years of inhaling industrial poison. The smell itself became a marker of social class. Workers who stank of the gasworks or the tannery could be identified from across a street. No amount of washing could remove the chemical residue that seeped into their skin and hair. They became walking advertisements for their own exploitation, marked by odors that announced their place in the industrial hierarchy. By the 1890s, some cities had become so poisoned that even the industrial barons who profited from the factories began to notice, not from conscience, but from simple self-preservation. When the air in your own neighborhood becomes thick enough to see, when your own children start coughing up blood, when your own servants refuse to venture outside without cloth masks, even the most hardened capitalist begins to consider that perhaps there might be limits to how much poison a human environment can absorb. The industrial stink age didn't end with regulations or reforms. It ended because the people who created it finally succeeded in poisoning themselves. The lesson was clear, even if it took decades to learn. Turn your environment into a toxic wasteland, and eventually you'll have nowhere left to run. Part 7. The Battlefield Smell of Death. July 4th, 1863. While Americans celebrated their independence elsewhere, the fields around Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, had become a charnel house that redefined the very concept of hell on earth. The battle had ended the day before, but the real horror was just beginning. In the summer heat, 50,000 casualties lay scattered across the countryside, and with each passing hour, the smell grew stronger. Welcome to warfare's most unspoken truth, the stench of mass death that haunted battlefields long after the last shot was fired. This wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of war. It was a force that broke minds, changed military strategy, and turned victory into an experience so nauseating that soldiers often preferred defeat. The mathematics of battlefield decay are simple and horrifying. A human body begins decomposing within hours of death. In summer heat, the process accelerates dramatically. Multiply that by tens of thousands of corpses, add in horses, mules, and other animals. Then factor in the reality that most battlefields were far from any infrastructure capable of handling mass burial, and you begin to understand why the smell of war could be detected from miles away. At Gettysburg, local resident Tilly Pierce, only 15 years old, wrote in her diary that the awful smell of the dead made it impossible to eat for days. She wasn't alone. Civilians for 20 miles in any direction reported that the wind carried what they could only describe as the breath of death itself, a smell so overwhelming that it seemed to coat the inside of your throat and lungs with invisible poison. The Union and Confederate armies faced an impossible task. Burying 50,000 bodies with the tools and manpower available would take weeks. But leaving them to rot in the July heat wasn't just morally unthinkable. It was a military disaster. The stench was so overpowering that it made the battlefield uninhabitable. Soldiers detailed to collect the wounded often collapsed from nausea before they could complete their missions. General George Meade, commander of Union forces, made a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. Priority went to burying Union dead, while Confederate corpses were left in massive piles doused with lime. The lime was supposed to speed decomposition and reduce the smell. Instead, it created a chemical reaction that made the stench even worse, a sickly sweet, burning odor that soldiers described as hell's own perfume. But Gettysburg was just one battlefield among hundreds that transformed entire regions into landscapes of olfactory torment. The Crimean War, fought in the 1850s, introduced European armies to the special horror of prolonged siege warfare in hot climates. Outside Sevastopol, British and French forces spent months in trenches surrounded by their own dead. The smell became so intense that soldiers developed a condition doctors called camp fever, though it had nothing to do with infectious disease and everything to do with the psychological breakdown caused by breathing death for months at a time. Florence Nightingale, famous for her work with wounded soldiers, wrote private letters describing conditions that her public writings carefully omitted. The hospitals reeked not just of infected wounds and poor sanitation, but of something far worse, the ever-present smell of men dying faster than they could be carried away. She described walking through wards where the living lay next to the dead for hours, sometimes days, because the stench outside was so overwhelming that burial details couldn't function. The American Civil War produced battlefield stenches on a scale that dwarfed previous conflicts. At Antietam, 23,000 casualties fell in a single day across a relatively small area. Photographer Alexander Gardner arrived 3 days later to document the aftermath and found his work almost impossible to complete. The smell was so intense that his horse refused to approach within a quarter mile of the main battlefield. Gardner and his assistants had to work in short shifts, retreating frequently to vomit and recover before returning to their cameras. The psychological impact of battlefield stench proved as devastating as the physical casualties. At Shiloh, survivors reported that the smell of death was so pervasive that men began hallucinating. They saw their dead comrades walking through the camps at night, though medical officers recognized these visions as symptoms of what we would now call post-traumatic stress, disorder triggered by the sensory overload of decomposition. World War I elevated battlefield stench to new levels of horror. The Western Front, with its intricate network of trenches, created perfect conditions for the kind of prolonged, concentrated decay that could drive men insane. At the Somme, bodies hung on barbed wire for months, slowly decomposing in full view of soldiers who had to live and fight within yards of the spectacle. The German army developed a grim innovation to deal with the problem. They created special units called corpse disposal companies, men equipped with gas masks not to protect against chemical weapons, but to enable them to work among the rotting dead. These soldiers had mortality rates higher than frontline infantry, not from enemy fire, but from the diseases that flourished in environments where death had become the dominant life form. French soldiers in the trenches developed their own coping mechanisms. They burned tobacco constantly, not just for comfort, but because the strong smoke was one of the few things that could partially mask the omnipresent stench of decomposing flesh. Some units went through their entire tobacco rations in a single day, preferring the risk of nicotine poisoning to breathing unfiltered air. The Battle of Verdun, fought over 10 months in 1916, created what historians have called the most thoroughly poisoned piece of earth in human history. The battlefield was so saturated with corpses that French engineers couldn't dig defensive positions without unearthing bodies from previous attacks. The soil itself had become a medium of decay, and rain turned the ground into a putrid mud that soldiers described as breathing, rising and falling with the gases released by decomposition. Artillery bombardments made everything worse. High explosive shells didn't just kill men, they scattered pieces of them across vast areas, creating thousands of smaller sites of decay that were impossible to clean up. Soldiers reported finding fragments of human bodies blown into trees, where they would hang for months, slowly rotting and releasing their stench with every breeze. The Spanish Civil War introduced the world to aerial bombardment of cities, and with it, a new form of civilian suffering. When German and Italian planes bombed Guernica in 1937, they didn't just destroy buildings, they created massive piles of rubble that trapped the bodies of the dead and dying underneath. For weeks afterward, the smell of decomposition seeped from beneath tons of concrete and stone, creating an atmosphere of horror that survivors carried with them for the rest of their lives. World War II brought industrial-scale death to battlefields across the globe, and with it, stenches that challenged human comprehension. The Eastern Front, where millions died in conditions of unimaginable brutality, created entire regions where the smell of death lingered for years after the fighting ended. Soviet soldiers, advancing through areas that had been contested for months, reported landscapes where nothing could grow, where the very soil had been poisoned by the chemical processes of mass decomposition. The siege of Stalingrad created its own unique horror. As winter turned to spring in 1943, the melting snow revealed thousands of bodies that had been frozen in place for months. The sudden thaw created an explosion of decay that made large sections of the city uninhabitable. Even after the Germans had been driven out, Soviet cleanup crews worked in shifts measured in minutes, not hours, because longer exposure to the stench caused what military doctors classified as battlefield neurasthenia, a condition that rendered men physically incapable of continuing their duties. Pacific theater battles presented different challenges, but equally horrific results. On islands like Tarawa and Iwo Jima, the combination of tropical heat, high humidity, and limited space for burial created conditions where the smell of death became a tactical factor in military planning. American forces learned to attack upwind whenever possible, not just to avoid enemy fire, but to avoid the psychological impact of advancing through air thick with the stench of their own dead comrades. The development of modern body armor and medical evacuation changed the nature of battlefield casualties, but did nothing to reduce the impact of battlefield stench. If anything, improved medical care meant that more wounded soldiers survived long, enough to experience the full psychological impact of fighting in environments saturated with the smell of death. Vietnam introduced a generation of American soldiers to the particular horror of jungle warfare, where high temperatures and humidity accelerated decomposition to rates that seemed almost supernatural. Veterans reported that the smell of death in the Vietnamese jungle was different from anything they had experienced, thicker, more penetrating, impossible to escape even with gas masks or breathing equipment. The use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange added new dimensions to battlefield stench. Not only did these chemicals strip the jungle of vegetation that might have helped filter the air, they also created their own toxic odors that mixed with decomposition to produce atmospheric cocktails that defied description. Some veterans reported that decades later, certain smells could trigger immediate flashbacks, not to visual memories of combat, but to the specific sensation of breathing poisoned air, thick with death. Modern warfare has done little to solve the fundamental problem of battlefield stench. If anything, high explosive weapons create more opportunities for the kind of scattered, partial decomposition that produces the most psychologically devastating odors. Military psychologists now recognize that olfactory trauma, psychological damage, caused specifically by smell, can be as debilitating as any physical wound. The Pentagon's current field manual for dealing with mass casualties includes detailed protocols for managing not just the logistical challenges of battlefield burial, but the psychological impact on soldiers forced to work and fight in environments where death has become the dominant sensory experience. These protocols exist because modern military commanders have learned what their predecessors discovered through bitter experience. Armies can be defeated not just by enemy fire, but by the simple biological reality that human beings were never meant to live and fight while breathing the concentrated essence of mass death. Part 8. The Fish That Choked the City. Summer 1976. The Potomac River was dying, and it was taking Washington, D.C. with it. What started as reports of a few dead fish near the Capitol quickly escalated into something that challenged the very notion of civilized urban life. Within days, millions of dead fish carpeted the river's surface from Georgetown to the Chesapeake Bay, a silver-gray blanket of decay that transformed one of America's most symbolic waterways into an open sewer under the summer sun. Welcome to nature's most apocalyptic tantrums. Mass fish die-offs that could empty cities, trigger religious panics, and remind humanity that when the natural world decides to rot, there's nowhere to hide from the consequences. The Potomac fish kill wasn't unique, but its proximity to the seat of American government made it impossible to ignore. The smell began on a Tuesday morning in July, when commuters crossing the 14th Street Bridge noticed what they assumed was a broken sewer line. By Wednesday, the stench had intensified to the point where office workers in buildings a half-mile from the river were calling in sick. By Friday, the House of Representatives had to close its riverside windows and run air conditioning at full blast just to make the chambers habitable. The mathematics of aquatic decomposition are particularly cruel. Fish, unlike mammals, have no natural defense against rapid decay once they die in warm water. Their scales trap bacteria. Their gills provide perfect breeding grounds for microorganisms, and their cold-blooded metabolism means they offer no natural resistance to the chemical processes that turn flesh into poison gas. A single dead fish weighing 1 pound can, under optimal conditions for decay, produce enough hydrogen sulfide and methane to make a small room uninhabitable. Multiply that by millions of fish spread across miles of river surface, and you begin to understand how aquatic die-offs could paralyze entire metropolitan areas. The Potomac disaster had company. That same summer, Lake Erie experienced a fish kill so massive that the smell reached Cleveland, 40 miles away. Commercial fishermen reported walls of dead fish stacked 6 feet high along the shoreline, decomposing in the summer heat into a sludge that local authorities couldn't remove fast enough to prevent what newspapers called the Great Stinking. But the 1970s fish kills were nothing compared to historical precedents. In medieval Europe, mass fish deaths were often interpreted as supernatural warnings. The Chronicle of Florence records that in 1448, the Arno River suffered such a massive fish kill that the smell drove citizens from the city for weeks. Contemporary accounts describe the air as thick with the breath of hell and attribute the disaster to God's judgment on the city's moral corruption. The religious panic was understandable. Before germ theory, before any scientific understanding of water pollution or ecological collapse, a river full of rotting fish seemed like clear evidence that the natural order had been fundamentally disrupted. Priests declared days of fasting and prayer. Citizens fled to the countryside, and through it all, the dead fish continued to decompose, releasing clouds of hydrogen sulfide that made the air itself seem cursed. China's Industrial Revolution has produced fish kills on a scale that makes historical precedents seem almost quaint. In 2007, the Thai Lake fish kill covered an area larger than some European countries. Dead fish stretched as far as the eye could see, and the smell was so overwhelming that the Chinese government evacuated entire towns along the lakeshore. Official estimates put the number of dead fish in the hundreds of millions, though independent observers suggested the real number was far higher. The Thai Lake disaster revealed something particularly sinister about modern fish kills. Unlike historical die-offs caused by natural factors like temperature changes or oxygen depletion, this catastrophe was the direct result of industrial pollution on a scale that nature had no mechanism to process. Chemical runoff from factories had turned the lake into a toxic soup that killed everything living in it, then continued to poison the air for months as the dead fish decomposed. Local residents described the smell as unlike anything in human experience. Not just the familiar stench of rotting fish, but something chemical and artificial that seemed to burn the inside of your nose and throat. Children developed respiratory problems that lasted for years. Adults reported that certain smells, even pleasant ones like cooking food, could trigger immediate nausea and flashbacks to the weeks when their entire world had been saturated with the smell of ecological collapse. The Thames has suffered multiple fish kills throughout London's history, but none more devastating than the great fish mortality of 1969. Pollution from industrial discharge and sewage had already turned the river into what conservationists called a flowing toilet. But the fish kill added a new dimension of horror. Dead fish clogged the intake pipes for London's water treatment plants, forcing the city to rely on emergency reserves while cleanup crews worked around the clock to clear the floating carpet of decay. The psychological impact of major fish kills extends far beyond the immediate sensory assault. There's something uniquely disturbing about seeing massive numbers of dead animals floating in the water that humans depend on for survival. Unlike battlefield casualties or plague victims, fish kills seem to represent the failure of the natural world itself. A reminder that the environment that sustains human life can suddenly and catastrophically collapse. In Bangladesh, the 2002 fish kill in the Baraganga River created a humanitarian crisis that lasted for months. The river, already heavily polluted by industrial waste and sewage, suffered a complete ecological collapse that killed virtually every living thing in the water. The smell was so intense that residents of Dhaka reported being unable to sleep with windows open, even during the hottest days of summer. But the real horror came from the realization that the Baraganga was a primary source of protein for millions of people. Fishing families who had worked the river for generations watched their entire way of life rot away in the summer sun. The smell of dead fish became the smell of economic collapse, social disruption, and environmental catastrophe, all rolled into one overwhelming sensory experience. Modern fish kills have taken on an almost supernatural quality because of their sheer scale. When industrial pollution or climate change triggers an aquatic die-off, the numbers can be staggering. The 2011 fish kill in the Arkansas River involved an estimated 100,000 dead fish spread across 150 miles of waterway. The smell was detectable from aircraft flying at 5,000 feet. Scientists now understand that fish kills often serve as early warning systems for environmental disasters that can affect human populations. When millions of fish die suddenly in a body of water, it usually means that something has gone catastrophically wrong with the ecosystem that humans also depend on. The stench of rotting fish isn't just unpleasant, it's nature's way of screaming that the environment has become toxic to life itself. Perhaps most disturbing is the growing frequency of fish kills in the modern world. Climate change, industrial pollution, and agricultural runoff have created conditions where aquatic die-offs are becoming routine rather than exceptional. Each new fish kill adds to a growing body of evidence that humanity has pushed the natural world past its breaking point, and the stench of rotting fish has become the signature scent of ecological collapse. Part 9: Disaster by Decay. September 8, 1900, Galveston, Texas, had been the jewel of the Gulf Coast, a thriving port city of 38,000 souls who believed their prosperity was permanent. By September 9th, the city had become a graveyard where the living envied the dead. The Great Galveston Hurricane had killed between 6,000 and 12,000 people in a single night. But the real horror began in the days that followed, when the Texas sun began its work on the largest concentration of human corpses in American history. Welcome to nature's cruelest lesson, that natural disasters don't end when the winds die down or the waters recede. They continue for weeks, sometimes months, as the warm embrace of decomposition transforms disaster zones into environments so toxic that survival becomes a daily act of heroism against your own senses. The mathematics of mass decay after natural disasters follow a simple, terrible progression. Bodies decompose faster in warm, humid conditions. Disasters create ideal conditions for rapid decomposition by destroying infrastructure, contaminating water supplies, and making organized burial impossible. Add in the reality that disasters often kill animals along with humans, and you create perfect storms of putrefaction that can make entire regions uninhabitable. In Galveston, the storm surge had deposited bodies throughout the city in patterns that defied all attempts at systematic recovery. Corpses hung from trees, lay buried under collapsed buildings, and were scattered across miles of debris-choked landscape. But the worst discovery came 3 days after the storm. When cleanup crews realized that the retreating waters had deposited hundreds of bodies in the city's cisterns and wells, the same water sources that survivors were depending on for drinking water, the smell began as something almost bearable, mixed with the salt air and the debris of destroyed buildings. But as the September heat intensified, the stench grew into something that challenged human endurance. Survivors reported that breathing became a conscious act of will. Each inhalation required mental preparation for the assault of putrid air that felt thick enough to chew. Dr. S.O. Young, one of the few physicians who remained in the city, kept a medical log that provides a clinical glimpse into hell. The odor of decomposition, he wrote, has become so pervasive that it seems to have weight. Patients report feeling as though they are drowning in poisoned air. Several have developed what appears to be hysterical vomiting, their bodies rejecting not food, but the very act of breathing. The city faced an impossible choice. Burying thousands of bodies would require weeks of work by crews who could barely function in the poisoned atmosphere. But leaving the dead to rot would make the city permanently uninhabitable. Officials made a decision that haunted survivors for generations. They loaded corpses onto barges and dumped them at sea, hoping the Gulf waters would carry away their problems. The plan backfired spectacularly. Within days, bodies began washing back onto Galveston's beaches, along with the beaches of every coastal community for 100 miles in either direction. The Gulf Coast became a continuous graveyard where families taking seaside vacations might encounter bloated corpses rolling in with the tide. The smell carried inland for miles, turning what had been a regional disaster into a multi-state nightmare. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 created its own version of decay-induced hell. As floodwaters receded from New Orleans, they revealed a city where normal life had become impossible, not just because of the destruction, but because of the overwhelming stench of decomposition. The heat and humidity of Louisiana in late summer created perfect conditions for rapid decay, and the flooded city became a petri dish for bacteria that thrived on death. Emergency responders required specialized breathing equipment, not just to protect against contaminated water, but to function in air thick with the gases released by decomposing organic matter. The smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was toxic. Hydrogen sulfide, methane, and ammonia, released by decomposition, reached concentrations that could cause unconsciousness or death with prolonged exposure. The psychological impact on survivors was devastating. FEMA counselors reported that many evacuees suffered from what they termed olfactory flashbacks, the tendency for certain smells to trigger immediate panic attacks and vivid memories of the post-storm nightmare. The human brain, it turned out, was particularly good at forming traumatic associations with smell, and the survivors of Katrina found themselves imprisoned by a sensory memory that could be triggered by something as innocent as food beginning to spoil. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami created disaster scenes where the normal human response to death, grief, burial, mourning became impossible because of the sheer scale of decomposition. In Thailand, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, beaches that had been tourist paradises became charnel houses, where bloated corpses lay scattered among the wreckage of hotels and restaurants. The tropical heat accelerated decomposition to rates that overwhelmed every attempt at organized response. Bodies that had been whole and recognizable in the morning became unidentifiable masses of putrefaction by evening. The smell was so intense that it could be detected from ships miles offshore. warning sailors to avoid coastal areas where the very air had become poisonous. Cleanup crews developed survival strategies that seemed almost medieval. They worked in shifts measured in minutes, not hours. They soaked cloth masks in alcohol or diesel fuel, believing that strong chemical odors might provide some protection against the biological assault on their senses. Some teams resorted to petroleum jelly smeared under their noses, creating a barrier that might delay the moment when the stench became unbearable. The Haiti earthquake of 2010 demonstrated how modern disasters could recreate the conditions of medieval plague cities. Port-au-Prince, already struggling with poverty and limited infrastructure, became a maze of collapsed buildings where tens of thousands of bodies lay trapped under concrete and steel. The tropical heat turned the rubble into a vast decomposition chamber that poisoned the air for miles around. International relief workers, trained to deal with natural disasters, found themselves unprepared for the sensory assault of mass urban decay. Many experienced responders, veterans of disasters around the world, reported that Haiti challenged their ability to function, not because of the scale of destruction, but because of the overwhelming stench that made normal human activity nearly impossible. The 2011 tsunami in Japan created a different kind of olfactory nightmare. When the waters receded, they left behind a landscape scattered with everything the ocean had claimed: cars, buildings, trees, and thousands of human beings. But the combination of salt water and industrial chemicals from damaged facilities had created conditions where normal decomposition was interrupted by chemical processes that produced odors unlike anything in previous disasters. Cleanup crews reported smells that seemed almost artificial, too complex and chemical to be purely biological, too organic and penetrating to be purely industrial. The disaster had created new forms of decay, new combinations of human and environmental destruction that produced atmospheric conditions for which there were no precedents and no effective countermeasures. These disasters reveal an uncomfortable truth about human civilization. We have built our cities and our lives on the assumption that nature will cooperate with our plans for disposing of our dead. When natural disasters disrupt those carefully constructed systems, when they force us to confront death and decomposition on scales that overwhelm our ability to cope, they remind us that the thin veneer of civilization is held in place partly by our success in keeping the smell of death at a manageable distance. The survivors of these disasters carry with them not just memories of loss and destruction, but sensory memories of environments where the very air had become an enemy. They know something that the rest of us can only imagine: what it feels like when the world itself begins to rot, and there's nowhere to run from the smell. Part 10: The Vanishing of Smell and Why That's a Problem. Walk through any modern American city and take a deep breath. What do you smell? If you're lucky, maybe coffee from a nearby cafe, exhaust from passing cars, perhaps the faint chemical temps of cleaning products. What you don't smell, what your great-great-grandmother would find miraculous, is the rich, complex, often overwhelming tapestry of odors that defined urban life for most of human history. We have won the war against stench, and in doing so, we may have lost something essential about our ability to survive in a world that's more dangerous than it's ever been. The transformation began in the late 19th century with the rise of what historians call the deodorization movement. It wasn't enough to solve the sanitation problems that had made cities uninhabitable. The new goal was to eliminate odor entirely. Sewage systems carried waste away underground, out of sight and out of smell. Industrial processes were redesigned not just to be more efficient, but to be odorless. Even human bodies were subjected to an escalating arms race against their own natural scents. By the 1950s, American cities had achieved something unprecedented in human history. Environments where people could live and work without being constantly reminded through their noses of the biological and industrial processes that sustained their lives. Indoor plumbing, air conditioning, industrial air filtration, and an entire industry devoted to personal deodorization had created a sensory bubble that protected urban dwellers from the smells that had shaped human civilization. The victory seemed complete and entirely positive. Who would argue for bringing back the stenches that had made London unbearable in 1858, or that had driven people from Manchester's industrial districts? Clean air was progress. Odorless cities were civilization triumphant over the biological chaos that had plagued humanity for millennia. But something unexpected happened in this deodorized world. People began losing their ability to detect danger through smell. The human nose, refined over millions of years of evolution to identify threats, became an atrophied organ in environments where most smells had been systematically eliminated. And in that sensory deprivation, new dangers found perfect conditions to flourish undetected. The first warning signs appeared in the 1960s, though few recognized them at the time. Industrial accidents that would have been immediately obvious to previous generations went unnoticed for hours or days because the chemicals involved were odorless. The 1984 Bhopal disaster in India killed thousands, partly because methyl isocyanate gas is essentially undetectable by human senses. People went to sleep breathing poison and never woke up, victims of an invisible atmospheric assault that their ancestors might have detected and fled from. Modern industrial facilities routinely handle chemicals that are thousands of times more toxic than anything our great-grandparents encountered. But many of these substances have been specifically designed to be odorless. The logic seems sound. Eliminate unpleasant smells to make industrial processes more socially acceptable. But the unintended consequence has been to create a world where some of the deadliest threats to human health and life give no sensory warning of their presence. Carbon monoxide poisoning has become the perfect killer for the deodorized age. This gas, produced by faulty heating systems, automobile exhaust, and industrial processes, kills hundreds of people every year precisely because it triggers none of the sensory alarms that might save their lives. Previous generations, living in environments where they were constantly exposed to a wide range of odors, might have developed more sensitive chemical detection abilities. Modern humans, raised in carefully scented environments, often fail to notice atmospheric changes that could kill them. The pharmaceutical industry has contributed its own chapter to the story of dangerous deodorization. Modern medications are designed to be as odorless and tasteless as possible, making it nearly impossible for patients to detect. When pills have decomposed into toxic compounds, or when they've accidentally consumed dangerous dosages. Historical medicine, for all its failings, at least warned people through smell and taste when something was seriously wrong. Consider the modern suburban home, that masterpiece of olfactory engineering. Central air conditioning systems filter and recirculate air to eliminate most natural odors. Cleaning products are designed to leave behind only pleasant, artificial scents. personal care products mask or eliminate natural human odors. The result is an environment so carefully controlled that residents often lose the ability to detect genuine threats. Radon gas, the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States, accumulates in basements and lower floors of buildings without producing any smell that might warn occupants of the danger. Mold growth, which can cause serious respiratory problems and neurological symptoms, often develops behind walls or in ventilation systems where it remains invisible and, in many cases, odorless until the contamination reaches dangerous levels. The food industry has created its own version of dangerous deodorization. Modern food preservation and packaging techniques can mask the natural smells that previous generations relied on to determine whether food was safe to eat. Meat treated with carbon monoxide retains its red color and lacks the odor that would normally indicate spoilage. Processed foods containing dangerous levels of preservatives or additives often smell and taste normal, leaving consumers with no sensory way to detect potential health threats. But perhaps the most sinister aspect of our deodorized world is how it has changed our relationship with environmental monitoring. Previous generations lived in constant sensory contact with their environment. They could smell when the air quality was degrading, when water sources were becoming contaminated, when their living spaces were developing problems that needed attention. Modern urban dwellers, insulated from natural odors by air conditioning, air fresheners, and industrial air filtration, often remain unaware of environmental problems until they reach crisis levels. The gradual accumulation of air pollution, the slow contamination of water supplies, the development of toxic mold in buildings. These problems can advance for months or years without triggering the sensory alarms that might prompt early intervention. The COVID-19 pandemic provided an unexpected glimpse into how much we've lost. When millions of people suddenly lost their sense of smell due to viral infection, they reported feeling disconnected from their environment in ways that went far beyond the simple inability to enjoy food. They described feeling vulnerable, unable to detect dangers that they couldn't consciously identify, but that their noses had been unconsciously monitoring. Environmental scientists have begun to recognize that the elimination of natural odors from human environments may have created a form of sensory disability that leaves populations vulnerable to threats their ancestors would have detected immediately. Industrial facilities now rely entirely on electronic monitoring systems to detect gas leaks and chemical releases, because human workers can no longer be trusted to notice atmospheric changes that might kill them. The perfume and air freshener industries have created artificial scent environments that actively interfere with human chemical detection abilities. Strong artificial fragrances don't just mask natural odors, they can temporarily damage the olfactory system's ability to detect subtle chemical changes in the environment. People who use heavy fragrances or who live in heavily scented environments often develop what researchers call scent fatigue, a reduced ability to detect important environmental chemical signals. Urban planning in the modern era has been shaped by the assumption that smell is merely an aesthetic consideration rather than a safety issue. Cities are designed to minimize odors rather than to optimize human sensory awareness of environmental conditions. The result is urban environments where people can live for years without developing the kind of chemical sensitivity that might warn them of slow building environmental threats. Climate change has begun to reveal the dangerous limitations of our deodorized world. As temperatures rise and weather patterns become more extreme, New forms of environmental threat are emerging that don't trigger the electronic monitoring systems designed to replace human sensory awareness. Algae blooms that produce dangerous toxins, chemical reactions in soil contaminated by industrial waste, the breakdown of aging infrastructure that releases decades-old pollutants. These threats often produce subtle changes in air quality that electronic sensors miss, but that a sensitive human nose might detect. The irony is that while we've eliminated most of the traditional sources of urban stench, we've replaced them with dangers that are potentially far more deadly precisely because they give no sensory warning. The Great Stink of London killed people through disease, but at least people knew they were in danger. Modern environmental threats often kill through long-term exposure to chemicals that remain completely undetectable until the damage is irreversible. Some scientists have begun advocating for what they call sensory rewilding, deliberately reintroducing humans to a wider range of natural odors, as a way of rebuilding our chemical detection abilities. The theory is that people who are regularly exposed to the full spectrum of environmental sense develop more sensitive and accurate abilities to detect when something in their environment has changed in ways that might indicate danger. The COVID-19 pandemic may have inadvertently begun this process for millions of people. As lockdowns reduced air pollution and industrial activity, many urban dwellers reported noticing natural scents that had been masked for years by automotive exhaust and industrial emissions. Some described the experience as smelling their city for the first time, becoming aware of environmental subtleties that had been invisible to their deodorized senses. But the window for sensory rewilding may be closing. As industrial activity returns to pre-pandemic levels and urban populations continue to grow, the pressure to eliminate environmental odors through technological solutions continues to increase. New generations are growing up in environments even more thoroughly deodorized than those of their parents, potentially creating populations with further reduced ability to detect environmental threats through natural sensory mechanisms. The ultimate irony of our war against stench is that we may have won the battle only to lose the war. We've created cities that smell clean and pleasant, but we've populated them with people who can no longer smell the danger approaching on the wind. In our rush to eliminate the offensive odors of the past, we may have eliminated our species' most ancient and reliable early warning system for environmental threats. The shadows of the past whisper a warning that our deodorized present might not want to hear. Sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones you can't smell coming. And in a world where the air itself has become a carefully manufactured product, that might be the most terrifying realization of all. The stench of history was unpleasant, often unbearable, sometimes deadly. But at least our ancestors knew when they were breathing poison. In our clean, odorless world, we might be doing the same thing. We just can't smell it anymore. The file closes here, but the questions it raises linger in the air around you. Are you breathing freely, or are you simply unaware of what you're breathing? In a world where danger has learned to hide its scent, your nose might be the only early warning system you have left, if you can still use it.